Call the meeting to order. This is a joint meeting with Council and Planning Commission. Mr. Regal is chairing the Planning Commission tonight. The recorder, please call the roll.
Councillor Solsky? Here. Councillor Savage? Here. Youth Representative? Councillor Fleck?
Here.
Councillor Stennett?
Here.
Councillor Irvin?
Here.
Councillor Roberts?
Here.
Mayor Gowing?
Here.
Planning Commissioner Member Darby Valley? Ashley Regal? Here. David Christopher?
Here.
Bo Solsky?
Here.
Garland Burback? Tim Burns? Blake Hoskin?
Okay, item 3 is a draft affordable housing implementation plan presentation. Mr. Mongan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Council and Planning Commissioners. Tonight we'll be holding a joint work session of the City Council and Planning Commission to discuss the draft Affordable Housing Implementation Plan report with the support of our consultants from Eco Northwest, who I'll introduce here just momentarily. But to begin, the City of Cottage Grove has advanced multiple efforts in the last 5 years to address local housing needs. In 2018 and 19, the city worked with Eco Northwest to prepare and adopt a housing needs assessment. In 2019, the city worked with ECO again to identify priority housing strategies for implementation. And in the years since, the city has been working to implement the recommendations from both projects. Strategies implemented to date include regulatory changes such as increasing densities in residential zones and removing maximum densities, reducing the minimum lot size requirements and increasing lot coverage allowances, adopting a multi-unit property tax exemption program, and supporting the school district to upzone surplus property to allow for multifamily development. City Council has also adopted a trust fund to help pay down system development charges and permit fees for regulated affordable housing projects. These changes have allowed for 120 new multifamily units to be permitted and developed due to the removal of maximum densities in MUPD, 19 new regulated affordable housing units due to the Affordable Housing Permit Trust and SDC Trust, and 13 of those being also benefiting from the MUPD program. And lastly, 3 new single-family dwellings were constructed where previous lot size requirements would have only allowed for 2. Now the city is working with ECO again to identify and evaluate additional measures the city can take to remove barriers to housing production. Eco Northwest has reviewed the city's zoning code, interviewed various developers that have worked in the city of Cottage Grove, and discussed infrastructure constraints with city staff, all to achieve the goals for this project, which are continue to reduce barriers to development of regulated affordable housing through tax abatement programs, development cost support and land acquisition, develop strategies to promote infill multifamily development, consider new regulatory changes that will promote more mixed-use development within the city's zones, and the preservation strategies for existing market rate and affordable multifamily stock within the city. For tonight's meeting, no public comment will be taken. There will be opportunities in the future when the final report is brought to the Planning Commission and later to the City Council as a proposed amendment to the city's comprehensive plan, specifically Policy 3, affordable housing, in the housing element of the comprehensive plan. And right now, I'll turn it over to our consultants at Eco Northwest. I see Becky's on here, so if you'd like to introduce yourself to the joint session.
Great, thanks, Eric. Hi, I'm Becky Hewitt. I'm a project director with Eco Northwest, and I'm joined by my colleague Leanne Ryan. I'm going to have Leanne get us started with an overview of kind of where we've been and our first couple recommendations, and I'll pick back up and we'll kind of cover all of the background and draft recommendations that we have for you, and then we're going to look for your feedback about whether those recommendations are going in the right direction and where your priorities are. And that'll help us inform the final affordable housing implementation plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leanne to get us started.
Eric, can you go one more slide? Thank you. So the background report included several key findings that were explored further in the draft implementation plan. A code audit revealed several regulatory items that might be limiting housing production, including height limits in the R2 and R3 zones, infill compatibility standards that could be limiting the potential for development near existing single family in particular, on-site open space requirements for multifamily development, and limitations on multifamily allowances in commercial zones. We also worked with staff to identify sites throughout the city that might have had infrastructure limitations, and therefore those sites hadn't been developed yet. But we also looked at key sites the city successfully partnered with developers on to deliver housing units. The background report also identified some market and financial factors, like a number of limited comparable developments to establish market rate pricing, which might be causing hesitancy for developers to bring forward new projects. But we also want to note that MUPD has been really helpful in making new market rate apartments feasible. The city also has a number of older apartment buildings where displacement could be a concern for existing residents given a really tight housing market. And the city's also been able to dedicate some funds for affordable housing development, but we noted that there are more partnerships and tools available to support that effort. Next slide, please. One more. So we'll get into the regulatory items here in a minute. So yeah, just to kind of set the stage for our presentation, the key topics we're looking for input are recommendations from the multifamily and commercial zones, open space requirements, tax abatement options, preservation strategies for those older apartment buildings I mentioned, and the construction excise tax. And then we also had a few other recommendations that we aren't going to concentrate as much on, but we will present them towards the end. One more slide. So we'll start with multifamily in commercial zones. So for context, existing regulations currently allow standalone multifamily development without a commercial component in the C2 zone outside of the historic overlay, and in the C2P and C2 zones through master plan approval only. Mixed use development is allowed only in the historic overlay in all three zones, but the historic overlay only exists in the C2 zone. Next slide, please. So in looking at creating more opportunities for multifamily development in those commercial zones, the draft strategies include a few options, and this slide shows how they relate to the existing allowances for context. It's a little hard to follow when we're jumping through the various zone names. But option one would allow for standalone multifamily throughout the C2P and CT zones, since it's currently already allowed in the C2 zone outside of the historic overlay. And then option two is to only require a commercial component on parcels with frontage on major streets. And then option three would be to allow mixed use development throughout the commercial zones shown here without a master plan process. Next slide, please. So in discussing the options with the advisory committee, they expressed a desire to keep commercial on key roads, including Row River Road, and expressed support for additional options for mixed use development, but with hesitancy to, there was hesitancy expressed about losing too much commercial land to residential uses. So based on their feedback and our recommendations, we recommend moving forward with option two and option three, which would allow mixed use development in all three commercial zones shown outside the historic overlay and without a master plan approval. This would allow standalone multifamily development to occur in the C2P and CT zones on parcels without frontage on major corridors. Without frontage on major corridors. So overall, this would allow more preservation of commercial lands to address the advisory committee's concerns, but it provides limited new potential for multifamily development because the feasibility of mixed-use development is more complicated and challenging in smaller communities like Cottage Grove. Okay, and then the next slide. So the other regulatory item identified in the code audit that was moved forward for further discussion in the draft strategies was on-site open space requirements. The code currently requires that in the R2 and R3 zone, 10% of the site area should be dedicated for open space and 5% in the C2 and RC. So there's a little bit more flexibility in the central business and residential commercial zones. And dimensions for the open space should meet a 20 by 20 minimum. The code audit included this as a barrier specifically for smaller infill sites where it can be challenging to find those open space areas that meet those dimensional requirements while also accounting for the building footprint and required parking. So city staff has said sometimes these spaces can end up awkward or unusable for residents. The next slide. So the draft strategies offer 4 options to consider to address the on-site open space requirements. Option 1 would be to exempt all residential development projects that are located near existing parks that have safe pedestrian access to the park. And then option 2 is to exempt residential projects from moving on-site open space requirements, is to exempt residential projects from providing on-site open space requirements if they are located near an existing park and they make improvements to the park that are eligible for SDC credits. So meaning the improvements made to the park would need to be on the city's SDC project list. Option 3 would be to exempt small projects entirely and projects in the C2 zone where there's already a pattern of urban development. And then option 4 would be to modify existing requirements to create more flexible options for providing on-site open space requirements for infill projects, like allowing rooftops and interior rec rooms to count towards open space. Next slide. So after discussing the options with the advisory committee, they expressed support for adding infill-friendly options such as roof decks or interior common areas. There was also some interest in exploring, oops, sorry, I'm one slide ahead of you, I think. Yes, there was also some interest in exploring a fee in lieu option that could be directed towards funding improvements at existing parks. But this can be somewhat complicated because of the city's existing parks SDCs. So more evaluation on that option would be necessary. And now I will turn it over to Becky to discuss tax abatements.
Thanks, Eric. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I think folks are aware that the city has an existing tax abatement for multifamily development called MUPD. It is not limited to apartments that have a specific level of affordability. It's just intended to help increase supply generally. It lasts for 10 years and is applied to the value of the building, but does not apply to the value of the land. There are a number of additional tax abatement programs available for regulated affordable housing under state statute. I'm going to talk about a couple of the options for those. You can go to the next slide. So for affordable rental housing, there are 3 options in statute. 2 of them are very similar, and the other is a little different. The top one listed there, City of Eugene uses this and calls it LIRPT, the Low Income Rental Housing Property Tax Exemption. It's not exactly what it's called in statute, but close enough. And so we can refer to it that way here. That applies to either nonprofit or for-profit developed affordable housing. It provides a full tax abatement for 20 years, and it is renewable if the property continues to comply. There's another version that applies only to nonprofit affordable housing. Also is a full exemption. It does not expire. It's just they essentially submit a form every year to show that they still meet the compliance requirements. And then the third option is authorized under the same statute as your existing MUPD program, but it is specifically for affordable housing. Can be for nonprofit or for-profit affordable housing, and it's more flexible in terms of the city setting the affordability criteria and any other criteria that would apply. Like the existing MUPD program, it applies only to the building value But unlike the existing levy program, it can last as long as the affordability restrictions are in place. Then there's one tax abatement program that's authorized into the statute for affordable home ownership that is in Portland, uses this, and they call it HOLTE. Again, not exactly the name in statute, but a helpful shorthand. They call it the Home Buyer Opportunity Limited Tax Exemption, but essentially it's for any affordable housing that is sold, that is for sale. It doesn't have to be detached housing. It can be any form of housing, as long as it's sold and units are sold individually. The criteria in statute is based only on sales price, but the city can apply its own additional criteria, such as limiting it to new construction, requiring that it have lasting affordability agreements in place, or other factors. It's a 10-year abatement with a hard stop at the end that is specified in statute and not something the city can change. When I've talked with affordable housing providers, they appreciate all of these things, but on the affordable home ownership, it's helpful to the home buyers. Even with the hard stop at 10 years, that's not a great part of the program, and unfortunately the city can't change that, but on balance, most of the affordable housing providers that I've talked to still support this program and do find the affordable rental housing programs beneficial. Next slide, please. So generally the advisory committee supported across all of these options, didn't have any real strong preferences among them. There was some specific support for the home ownership abatement in particular, but generally pretty broad support. All of these abatements require support from the overlapping taxing districts in order to apply beyond the city's own rate, which if you don't get that support, it's a pretty limited abatement. It doesn't help all that much. So it's very important to get sufficient support from the overlapping taxing districts to have them all apply. It's the same criteria that was true when you implemented the MUFTI program. You need 51% of the tax roll, effectively, those districts to support it. So the school district could, combined with the city, could account for that 51%. So a little more conversation needed with those overlapping taxing districts to see if they would support some additional abatement programs. Next slide, please. We also looked at the construction excise tax. It is a tax on new development that is a percentage of permit value. It also applies to expansions, but not to remodels that keep the same square footage. There are two versions of it, well, I guess technically three, but there's two that matter outside of the metro region. One that's for school districts and one that's for affordable housing. We're talking here about the one that's for affordable housing specifically. That one can apply to commercial, industrial, and or residential development. If you apply it on residential, the rate is capped at 1% of permit value. There's no statutory limit on the percentage you can apply to non-residential development, only practical limits on the amount that is reasonable to charge. If you can go to the next slide, we looked at if you had had a construction excise tax in place over the past 5 years, and you had still seen the same permit activity that you saw over the last 5 years, how much revenue that would have generated. So we tested this at a 0.5% rate. That's not the maximum you can charge, but is for a smaller community, it's maybe a decent place to start thinking about this. As you can see on the commercial and industrial side, the revenue potential was really very, very, very limited. On the residential side, the revenue potential was higher, and you can see the different colors represent where those funds would need to be allocated given what the parameters are in statute. So most of it goes to city programs to support affordable housing or provide the developer incentives is things like SDC abatement. So you already have a fund for that. It could contribute additional resources to that fund, for example. And then the dark blue piece is just general affordable housing programs as defined by the city. If you go to the next slide, Our draft recommendation here is not to advance the CET. The advisory committee was pretty skeptical of this across the board. You have pretty low revenue potential on the commercial industrial side. And given how much the city is working to encourage residential development as it is, having something that's an additional cost at the same time you're implementing incentives kind of works against itself. In addition, although you can have both a school district CET and an affordable housing CET, they are just multiple layers of costs, and it's just another thing to think about. So that's not a reason why you can't, it's just something to consider and whether it's the right choice. So our recommendation is not to advance a CET at this time. You can go to the next slide. Leanne mentioned that the existing older apartment buildings, what we're calling low-cost market rate housing, we looked at what you could do as a city to help improve conditions and help prevent displacement of existing residents. This is a very complicated space. It is not easy to intervene in the private market in that way with existing residents, existing property owners. It's pretty challenging. There are kind of two basic paths available. Neither of them is easy. On the first one there, you can help nonprofits or others to acquire and rehabilitate and preserve existing buildings and convert them basically to regulated affordable housing. Talked to a number of affordable housing providers about this. It is not easy. Having flexible funds to acquire the properties is one of the major barriers, but even with that, there are still a lot of, it takes a long time to kind of get the funding in line, and it's a pretty challenging thing. So the city could help with that potentially through providing some flexible funds, but it's pretty tricky. And then the other option is to try to work directly with the existing property owners and provide some financial incentives for them to make upgrades to the property, prioritizing health and safety improvements, but to do that while stabilizing rents for the existing residents. That's also not a super easy thing to do. So, working with those property owners and trying to make a lot of decisions about what's appropriate and what are the priorities and how to structure financial terms. So either of these could potentially be a pretty big lift for a city the size of Cottage Grove, but you guys are an ambitious and accomplished bunch. And if you are interested, I think there are things that you could explore further within that realm. Next slide, please, Eric. So this is a recap of all of our recommendations. I don't know for those of you sitting in a room if this is at all legible. So I'll try to read them out in case this is tiny, tiny print from where you're sitting. So the code changes that Leanne talked about, our recommendations include expanding the options for multifamily in the commercial zones through allowing mixed use across all those 3 zones, as well as allowing standalone multifamily outside the historic overlay for sites that do not have frontage on major streets. The second one that Leanne touched on was the flexibility to meet open space requirements for infill projects through some infill-friendly on-site options, as well as maybe a fee in lieu option, something to explore. The 2 other things on this list are potentially a 10-foot height bonus for affordable housing projects, which could help them in smaller infill sites be able to achieve enough units to make the project more viable and easier to administer and operate over time. And then clarifying a clearer exemption for multifamily development from the infill compatibility standards that are really written with more of a single family infill context in mind. On the infrastructure side, we understand you have some upcoming infrastructure planning processes, and so staff suggested a policy that would require your master plans to consider and prioritize housing and areas planned for housing when identifying and prioritizing future projects. So that would be just sort of a high-level statement that would inform your upcoming work. And then on the market and financial side, continuing the work you've done with land acquisition for affordable housing whenever you're able to allocate resources to it. That's a great approach. I mentioned the tax abatements for rental and home ownership for regulated affordable housing. Also, another one on there is to basically do a market study in a year or two. That would be looking at housing demand in a kind of nearer term lens. Several of the developers that we talked to said, there was a clear need for more housing and apartments and a variety of housing types when we, first started down these projects. But now that some has been delivered, we're not sure how much more demand there is in the near term. So this would be a way to kind of look and show developers where there's still a need for additional housing and where there's demand. And then the last one that I touched on was working with property owners, affordable housing providers, the county, and other stakeholders to try to see where you could put together a program that would support housing preservation, given what the city can bring to the table and the challenges inherent in developing a program like that. And with that, I think we'd like to get your feedback on whether these recommendations are going the right direction, if there are things you would like to see refined for the final affordable housing implementation plan, and if there are priorities that you would want the city to move forward on most quickly as part of implementing that plan. Eric, I think I'll pass it back to you to moderate that.
That'd be me. So I'll back up the slide deck so we can kind of just see these things. Again, this is more of an open discussion, less of the rules and regulations that you might see during a regular public hearing. So just encourage you, if something jumped out at you during the presentation, just let us know. We'll go to that slide, and then we can have a discussion, take some good notes, and see where we want to go from there. That said, does anyone want to open up the discussion?
Councilor Fleck has his hand up.
So a couple pieces that, excuse me, I'm a snuffleupagus tonight. The step downs, I'm not opposed to doing a height bonus, but I do want to keep in place the stepping between the different properties. That was something we talked about, in the committee, because I certainly don't want to impact existing, R1 development by putting in, a huge, multi-story thing in close proximity. So that was one of the pieces. One of the other considerations as I was listening, I don't remember in your recommendation if we're going to do it in proximity to parks, but I think a quarter mile is too far. Basically, the city's a couple miles across, and I think a quarter mile would be too far. Those are the two things that jumped out at me that we talked about at the committee level that I wanted to offer.
If I may, so Councilor Fleck brought up another portion of the report that wasn't specifically spoken to this evening. Just looking at different ways to encourage that infill development of multifamily at a higher stature. Currently, right now in the code, there's what's referred to as the R1 step down requirement. That is when you have a higher density zone, such as R2 multifamily residential or R3 adjacent to R1. When there's existing single family dwelling there already, you have to add an additional foot of setback for every additional foot of height adjacent to that development. Now, the code does allow for that to be waived, if you will, if staff and planning commission makes a determination that that existing dwelling is redevelopable, which puts the city staff and the developer in kind of a bad spot where you're saying your house just isn't worth that much. So it's not ever been used. We haven't had the need, thankfully. When we discussed this in committee, it was really just an opportunity to say, okay, how can we get a couple extra feet? Because it really does come down to units, rents, and that pro forma to get it to pencil. as Council Flex said, we never really landed on anything specific on this item, but love to hear what folks' thoughts are.
Councilor Irvin.
And thank you for the presentation, for the research on this. Recall being in that committee with Councilor Fleck and a number of others when this housing needs analysis was originally put out. And there was, some conscious changes knowing that we needed to address some of the affordability issues that we had. Putting more units available what seemed to be the way forward, putting them out in the market. And the theory was that with more supply and we didn't know what was going to happen with demand, that per unit prices should in theory go down. But it was a conscious awareness that this is going to change the feel of Cottage Grove, because as you have more infill, lot sizes can be, they'll just shrink the available space. And at the time, I believe Councilor Fleck was the one holding the flag saying, I'm not so sure about this. I don't know that this is a good idea. And I was on the other side of the fence, and I may have over time moved back and thought about what this is going to look like, especially considering the additional traffic on our roads, just the way it changes neighborhoods as additional apartments go in. And so I'm of the opinion right now that it's too early to be making additional changes. We haven't seen what's happened yet. And, we're on track, I believe, percentage-wise already to meet the analysis of new units. There may be some variance in the different types of units. So it's great to be looking at this and thinking about it and being prepared. I would just put forward that I think it's a little early to be making additional changes to things like infill and things that are going to affect how many units. That being said, if things do proceed forward, the one thing that I saw on there that I thought seemed pretty reasonable, if you are going to have more infill, the consideration of different uses of open space. But the last thing I'll say on this, any one of these things we're changing, I think it is important to think of why it was put in the first place. And I did notice that was somewhat missing out of this analysis, especially as it came to open space and some of the other changes, why we have these zones, why we did it in the first place. And I'd like to see more on that so that you can weigh more implications, because admittedly this is not an area of expertise for me on how these things are affected. Thanks.
Councilor Roberts.
Thank you, Mayor Gowing. I realize growth is inevitable. We're facing a certain amount of growth. But, how many people can we fit in the fishbowl with our topography to the point it's going to create gridlock and take away the quality of life that is Cottage Grove? I worry about that. I also worry about rapid growth to the point of it compounding our problems, which are currently in this community having to deal with. Homelessness, getting our police force back on track and full power. There's a lot of issues that go around all this. When I see the possibility of maybe putting buildings up to 50 feet tall, so I'm just wondering, was there in any of this conversation, how big does this committee feel the population of Cottage Grove can get to? When I got here, it was 7,500. We're now approaching 11,000. How many people can we fit in this thing before it does affect the quality of life for everybody?
Sure.
But like I say, I understand growth is inevitable. So that's the question I have.
And it's a good one. And, the simple planner speak would say only the economy really knows that question, the answer to that question. Increasing a building height might drive one project, but does it drive 10? Is hard to say at this point in time. I would say that right now in the existing code, there is a path to get a 10-foot height bonus if you're doing mixed use in an allowed zone. So some of those things already exist here. And then an example of, development that predates the land use code that we have right now would be the affordable, the housing authority building here just across the river in its height. So it's difficult to say, you know, is it the chicken or the egg on that? I would say, for example, though, the property south of town, adjacent to Cleveland, off the end of 4th Street, I believe it's about 66 acres. It's currently zoned R2, which means it's multifamily residential. You can do single family residential in that zone as long as you meet the 8 dwellings per acre. But we also don't have a maximum density. So it could be an enormous development, honestly. Under the current code, no changes today. I think what these proposals are just trying to do is evolve with where people are today. Our comprehensive plan was adopted, I believe, in 1983, and it still leans heavily on timber industries and things like that. But I think most of us know that the economy has shifted, whether it's more of a service-based economy or whatever you want to call it in the economic realm. What this does is try to meet what we do, let's say LTD, South Lane Wheels, putting people in densifying areas such as downtown, which is a prime example. It's an extremely densely populated area, and it's wonderful to be in. It's vibrant. There's, you know, life in that space. Hence some of the proposals for our commercial corridors to have that, you know, non-frontage potential for outright residential or multifamily residential. And on that, the importance of that is the financing on mixed use is not typical financing. And so that option is being proposed as part of this report, just recognizing what we heard from our stakeholders during the background report part of this project and understanding how those projects actually occur. Our commercial corridors are generally along Highway 99 and Main Street. Outside of that, and it's just Main Street to the river and then out to the east.
Well, like one of my concerns is vehicle gridlock. There are certain times of the day and week where it can literally take 20 minutes to get from Primark to downtown, especially if a train comes through. But then we're also having a lot of problems with traffic up at Harrison, the new Harrison on Taylor. I've gotten a ton of voters that have been calling me about the gridlock because a lot of parents aren't following the rules when they pick up their kids. That's part of the problem. Still, I'm just saying, more people coming in here. I just want to make sure that we're aware and cautious of that so we don't ruin the quality of life for the people that are here.
Absolutely. And from a current code's perspective on that topic, we have to abide by the state's transportation planning rule analysis. Okay, that's not something that's done by staff. It's got to be done by a licensed engineer. There are some triggers that make that happen, though, such as 300 additional trips per day or weights of vehicles, things like that, on whether or not it actually elevates to a full traffic study or analysis. Those analyses lead to things like you see in the Northwest neighborhood, for better or worse, on one-way streets, right? Where you can't go from N Street east onto Birch, things like that. Those are the mitigation items that keep the feel of that neighborhood by not allowing traffic to proceed through that area. And that's the whole process, the planning process that attempts to address that. But I would add, if you're putting new labor, new employment opportunities, new services co-located with residential, how many vehicle trips per day do you generate if you're already there? And so maybe you're right, that doesn't work for Cottage Grove, but it's something that I think people are looking for. And I mean, you see it here in our downtown where, you know, when we've got the bank building remodel or the club building, those apartments were just scooped right up. People wanted to be there because of the ability to just be there.
I understand growth is inevitable. I'm just saying, I just hope that as we as a council and as a commission look at the people that have invested years of property tax and time into this community for what we're adding to the town. That's all. And I want to thank you for your explanation very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let's move on.
Councilor Soulsby.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a couple of comments and a question. I want to throw out there that our fire trucks can only reach so high. And so I'm hoping that that's being taken into account. Also, I do agree with Councilor Urban on, I would love to, we're on target by looking at the study right now with our growth. I would love to see it look at it in the future, but do variances to some of these things can always be brought back. Also, my question is there's some talk about commercial excise tax and as an incentive to throw back to builders and to create more of this. Who's paying that excise tax? Is that to the builders? Is that a city tax, or who is that?
So the CET, Councilor Solfi, is only at new construction, only at the point of new construction. So the modeling that they proposed there that didn't really show a lot of return because we haven't had a lot of new commercial development in the last 5 years, would be 0.5% of the permit cost. So if the permit was $100, it would be whatever, $5, or 5 cents, 50 cents, whatever my math's. And then that just goes into this kitty that then, like the existing trust fund that this council adopted for SDCs and permits, it could backfill that. It's just another revenue stream. As they pointed out, because we already have the $1.25 per square foot CET that goes to the school district, it could be a little bit of double dipping or a little bit too much to bite off on it. So staff's in agreement with that at this time, that's just not the best mechanism to fund an affordable housing program.
Commissioner Christopher.
2 questions. What is the affordable housing definition that's being used? And are we on track for the housing requirements as per state for our growth? I mean, they project multiple cities up to 2040 or something. Your population is going to be here, so you need X amount of housing units. How are we standing with that?
So I'll defer here in a minute to Becky and Leanne if they want to chime in on our definition of affordable housing, but I'm going to say that it hasn't really been defined. What we're saying is that through the process, council would adopt a number, whether it's 40% AMI, something like that, and then that's the running number. And then, you get into the other half of affordable housing, which is the mechanism for which it's done, whether it's plain or speak capital A affordable housing, or if it's, just privately funded, sourced, or publicly sourced, but not city related, but then maintained at that regulated percentage of AMI. Regarding projections on development, the housing needs analysis assessment that was done in 2018 and 19 said 69 units a year for the next 25 years. And as several councilors have pointed out, we did get a nice bump with the multifamily that came in as a benefit to Mupti. But I'll tell you, we've only permitted 3 houses this year. Not really sure why. I think if I'm honest, it's due to a lack of shovel-ready lots at this time. The phase 1 of Sunrise Ridge is down to, I think, 3 undeveloped lots. So that's problematic. After that, it's infill or folks who have larger lots, carving them up, selling them off individually, things like that. And so that's been a problem. Recently, though, a subdivision was approved and is going through recording on Sweet Lane, which will provide an opportunity for 10 dwellings. It's going to be 5 townhomes, so that's a good shot, but likely that they'll fall more into next year's number. If we're going to maintain that 69, we'll have to make up for this year at some point in that arc of things. What if you're asking in regard to our urban growth boundary? As far as developable land stock, that large parcel, the large 4 parcels down there off the end of 4th Street between that and Cleveland, that really, lays out the future for us, to be honest with you, because it has a ton of potential. Because it's R2 multifamily, I mean, outright permitted in the code today, of course, with Planning Commission blessing and going through the process of meeting clear and objective standards, which is a requirement of law. It could be 1,000 apartments. tomorrow, if the economy allows.
Yeah, and if the infrastructure could handle it.
Well, and so that's the thing. That's where we get into those offsite improvements. Just because, they want it, and sewer pipes only so big, or they're below and they need a lift, that's part of their work, right? They need it for themselves. It does offer them SDC credits when they install those things. That kind of pays itself back. But those things would all have to go through that stuff in order to get there. I do think that it's a ways off. While good, consistent growth is healthy for a community, allows folks to be able to stay in place and things like that, as opposed to having to move away. I just don't think economically we're there yet.
Thank you.
Commissioner Burback.
I think that this low-income lucky thing would be something for the city to look at, because everybody seems to be concerned about low-income people, and I think that's one issue that would help with builders doing things like Blackstone probably should get a medal for redoing those buildings downtown here. And and I also, when I go over and lose money playing bingo, I always look at those things behind the American Legion Hall. And I think that those things are very nice. They'd be really nice in any neighborhood, I think. And I just think those are the kind of things that they're concerned about, the lower income people that the city should look at, besides the regular lucky stuff that's going on.
Anyone else? Councilor Stennett.
And echo a couple of things that I've already heard. And I do believe growth is inevitable. I think a town that's growing and raising healthy families is going to grow anyway, if it gives them the opportunity to stay here and to put down roots and to contribute to the community. I think it's, with affordable housing, it seems like we're talking more about what kind of, managing our growth, what kind of growth we want. I think it fills a niche in the housing market. It allows people in transition to stay here maybe, or allows people to get their start here, and maybe, give that time that they need to get the job that's going to put them here, and, to fulfill the dream of the house and the yard and everything. But also support the call for kind of another look at the market demand. I think we put a lot of apartments on the market. Obviously, they're being very well received, it sounds. But that happened really fast. It'd be nice to kind of see. I think things seem pretty volatile at this stage, without me knowing too much about housing. I also had a question. How often do you think potential developers are bumping up against the limitations of our code? Is that really a common, frequent issue?
Counselor, yes, I do. But it's more of that shovel-ready issue, right? So the barrier on the front side is that the road's not built in front of it, or the utilities haven't been extended, which then leads them to only really be looking for that infill type development. So Harrison Village Apartments is a great example of something that became available through a process done by the school district and then supported by the city to upzone it from R1 to R2, that allowed them to just be able to build behind the sidewalk. I mentioned now a couple times the property just north of Cleveland. There's nothing out there. Well, cows, right? That's the one that creates this barrier. So then when you're looking at our whole system and our land supply, yeah, we've got a ton of square footage, but we're not connected to it yet. And so that's where developers get a little cold on that. And so that's where discussions like this and plans and studies can look and say, okay, where can we squeeze, maybe some of these numbers are a little too dramatic, but even if we're getting 2 more dwellings where we could only get 4, that can make a difference. Those are the little difference makers along the way that I think developers are more interested in. when I'll tell a little story about what Mupty did at the corner of 22nd and Whitaker. A property owner owned the land. He's also a contractor. He was just planning on building a duplex. I advised him that council adopted Mupty. Well, now it's a fourplex. So we were able to get those 2 more dwelling units, putting those folks right there on a commercial corridor. There's an LTV bus stop in the front right away, right in front of it, and Walmart's right across the street. So it's just a great opportunity for that. I would add to kind of bring in a little bit of that open space discussion, because I do think that's an opportunity area for us. Our code currently says that triplexes and quadplexes, while considered multifamily by building code and development code, aren't required to have open space. So the code's already trying to maximize those lots for that type of development. An opportunity there, a strategy out of this report could be, okay, let's make it 5s and 6s or something like that, where we're not adding 20 and we're not necessarily having to go 20 feet taller. We're just allowing for it without having to add 10% of the property.
Councilor Savage.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. I think it's really important that we look at both the term affordable housing and low income. We've had an influx of apartments come in over the last 6 or 8 months, which is fantastic. That does alleviate families bunking together and kids who cannot live in town that they grew up in. They've had to move away. But there's a component that we need to address, which really is that low income and the affordable housing. I mean, really the low income. And if we are going to be putting folks into a shelter, where are they going to go? And that's going to be the low income. And that takes time and energy and lots of red tape to create that space to move into. And so the sooner that we can approve something for a low income, the sooner we can have somewhere for folks to go into. So I think that's a really important component to look at as well. Thanks.
Councilor Roberts.
I agree with all of that. You know, the model we used with the tiny homes worked, but the one problem I see with it, for the amount of people we're putting on that amount of space, you know, it does create great little housing for people. But with the amount of buildable space that we have in this town, doing more of those kind of projects. So we got to find a way to address the low income housing. Definitely. Because, I mean, for me, as we've been going through this whole thing with the Highway 99 thing and the homeless, we don't yet have an end game for the people that can get into this program or any program, whether it's us or somebody else, graduate like the one I did and have some type of housing to graduate to. So I'd like to make sure that that is part of the overall plan too. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Anyone else? Councilor Fleck?
Yeah, just one kind of final comment. I really appreciate Councilor Urban's comments because, gosh, in my years on the Planning Commission and City Council, I've always kind of fought for those quality of life, small town pieces. For years, they were trying to push smart growth, which was narrow streets and, you know, on-street parking and a lot of things that really end up with conflicts between people in a small town. And so I think this plan actually is a good compromise. I think it allows some of the things that allow a little bit more dense development without seriously impacting the quality of life for small town residents. You know, there may be little pieces of this we want to tweak, but I do want to kind of caution us against knee-jerking too much about shutting down. Vacancy rate still is 1% right now. We've had the school district talk about how they can't keep teachers in the school district because we don't have available housing. And as Mr. Mongan mentioned, we still are missing our single family dwellings at the moment. So I do want to caution us about reeling back too quickly, but I fully support evaluating this on an ongoing basis to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our citizenry. But at this point, with the proposal that's being presented and the committee's recommendations, I think it's a pretty good piece, and I certainly support seeing it going forward.
Anyone else?
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yes.
So, Council Fleck, thank you for kind of jogging my memory. So, this, of course, this document is a very high-level document. Right? It's the aspirational goals that Council potentially, hopefully, will adopt at least some part or in whole into the comprehensive plan. And then from there, staff comes through and actually puts together actionable ordinances that address these strategies. So, adopting this in some version or form is only the first step of several along the way, where we get into the little bit more minutia on how many additional feet is enough, how much more dense or non-dense is preferred. So it doesn't necessarily flip the switch the next day. It just gives us a path to look forward to and see, okay, are we meeting these goals so that we can try to house as many folks as we can by creating a housing stock that fits all the different levels of income.
Okay. If there's nothing else, we will adjourn. We have like a 3-minute recess before the regular meeting.